entire computer screen. Great, that's it, Mike. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. All right, so I think just like Dave did last week, it's important to welcome everybody during these very weird times that we're living in. And the one benefit that we've had from lockdown is that I think a lot of people are getting used to the technology, and these sharing platforms are becoming a lot more popular. So congratulations to BirdLife South Africa, who's a big supporter of ours. So thanks to them, they launched their webinar series last night. And it just goes to show that there's so much content out there that's available for sharing, and people are sitting in the comfort of their homes and they're getting stuff that they could never find in field guides or bird books. And to hear live conversations is so much more, I think, valuable and rich. So we are living through difficult times, and I hope everyone's staying safe. We're participating in a birding lockdown challenge, and I'm coming very far down the list, which is a bit of a pity, but I'll get over that. So let's get started. We are doing a webinar today on tips and tricks for bird photographers. And before I go any further, I'm going to introduce our guest for the evening. So let me just do an intro before he even speaks. He's certainly one of the most passionate birders and photographers that we know. He's a medical doctor in his spare time. So generally when he's out on a twitch, he gets a call to get back to his rooms, and he has to rush back to his rooms, much like the rest of us rush from our offices to a twitch. He does it the other way around. And he's pretty impulsive as a twitcher. We've known him to drive from Cape Town to the Caprivi to tick a yellow-throated leaflove. So that's the kind of caliber we're dealing with here. And there he is on his tripod and his large lens. And he has this dressing gown attire at Twitches. There he is with Keir Lynch, who's also a good friend of ours. And that, if I'm not mistaken, was the Aperture warbler. So before I say anything more about you, Mike, and put you down anymore, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mike. It's very honored to be asked to join you. I won't pass up any opportunity to talk about the two best hobbies in the world. So thank you very much for the invite, and good evening to all those listening. I'm keen to see some of the photographs and learn from everyone and hear what they have to say as well.
Thank you very much, Mike. Maybe where did the dressing gown thing come from? Is there a story, or is it just more comfortable?
That particular twitch that you've got there in the photograph, it was a very, very cold day, and traveling up long distances on these twitches gets quite cold, and I like to be comfortable. But the story developed in that any twitch that I did have the gown, we didn't fail to see the bird. So there's a tongue-in-cheek bit of superstition attached to the gown, and we joke that some of the other birding friends always ask, please bring the gown to make sure that we see the bird.
I must be honest, I am very disappointed to say that I've never joined you on a twitch when you're wearing your gown, so we'll have to rectify that when lockdown is over. Right,
that sounds like fun.
Let's kick off. We sent you all a survey, and we had a really cool response. We just wanted to kind of get a feel for where we're pitching this, and maybe as a disclaimer to start with, I'm definitely not a professional photographer. I think Mike is a lot closer to that than I am, but I've been photographing birds for probably 15 years, maybe even a bit longer, and I keep a record of all the birds I've photographed, and I have an Instagram page, and I love sharing my photographs with my friends, and I think it's a good way to remember the birds that you've seen and the places that you've been. So I'll tell you where I fit in the categories in a second, but we asked you these questions. I think you've all been through them. So sort of working down from the most professional to some people that are joining us this evening that have never photographed birds. So this was the results that we got, and that was at about 5 o'clock this evening. There might have been a few more. We had 271 responses, and we're very pleased to see that the orange and green segments are pretty much where we had hoped to pitch this webinar. I'm delighted that there aren't any dark blues, or certainly not many of them. I'm hoping that we're not presenting to professional photographers, because firstly, they won't learn that much, and they'll probably disagree with most of what we say. But also, it appears that we're talking to people who are either serious about their photography or have a mild interest and would probably like to learn a little bit more. I think categorizing myself, I put myself as a red category. I think I'm a serious amateur photographer. I've had a few photographs published in various things. Mike, where would you put yourself?
I'm very much the same place, Mike. I'm also learning things as I go still. I know that there's always something to learn. I don't consider myself a professional photographer at all, but it is a big passion of mine, and I have been taking photographs for, well, since I was a child, basically. I was given one of those little box cameras that you look through from the top by a grandparent. So I was into photography before I was into birding. But yeah, I certainly don't make a living out of photography. I don't think many people do these days.
Yeah, it's become tough with the amount of people that are taking great photos. So just as an amusing aside, we had one response under other. The response was, I have the gear, but no idea. So maybe if you're one of those people, hopefully this will help you a little bit. Okay, so we're essentially...
I think...
Yes.
Sorry,
Dave.
I'm just going to interrupt. So I'm definitely the weakest link here. I do own a camera, and I think I fall into a category which we didn't include in the survey, which is a birding photographer. So I see myself, or I see a camera very much as a tool to, if I can see a nice bird and I can take a great photo, that's awesome, and I'm chuffed. But I see it very much as a tool to take photos of birds and to help me identify birds. So yeah, I think increasingly with digital photography that's become more and more of a trend.
Yeah, Dave, apologies for leaving you out there. Yeah, I think that's probably the way I started, and have developed a little bit more seriously than that. But yeah, I think there are a lot of people who are in exactly that category where they're using their cameras to take pictures of birds and keep a record of them, as well as to help with identification. And that is something we're going to speak about this evening. So we've decided that the content is just too much to deal with in one webinar, and we still have 3 weeks of lockdown to look forward to. So we're going to cover the photography webinars in parts of 2 parts. The first part we'll talk about trends, some of the equipment, camera settings, and I think for me the most exciting bit is some tips that we have for being in the field. And then next week, next Wednesday, so diarize that, we're going to deal with some of the processing, storage, a bit of creativity, and sharing on Facebook and Instagram, publishing, and then obviously a very important part of bird photography is making sure that we don't disturb the subjects that we're photographing. And Mike and I have got one story each that we'll share at the end of this webinar, and we might throw in 1 or 2 more at the end of next week. Mike, you are on sort of probation. So if you're good tonight, we'll invite you back. Otherwise, we might have to find a substitute.
I'll try my best.
Okay. All right. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of the really technical stuff, because I think people want to learn about the field stuff. But let's whip through some of these things. Pre-DSLR, which is probably pre-2000, photographs were taken on pretty much the same looking cameras as we have today, although not more sort of mechanical rather than electronic. We used photographic film. You can see a little 400 ASA 24 exposure cartridge there. So the huge barriers in those days was taking photographs and having to wait 2 or 3 weeks before you actually saw the results of what you took. You couldn't take 37 flight shots of a European honey buzzard, because it would cost your parents a fair untold fortune to develop them, and also the shutter, the buffer speeds and the burst rates were not quite what they are today. So Mike, you spoke about a camera that your grandparents gave you, but I assume you used these film cameras back in the day.
Yeah, I've got boxes and boxes of slides which don't get taken out very often anymore. But yeah, the switch to digital was just phenomenal in terms of the learning curve as well. You learn from your errors very slowly in the old days.
That's correct. It takes you 3 weeks and then you've forgotten what your setting was by the time you actually look at the slide that came out. But I must say there was a real joy in getting those slides back. I remember my father used to come back from the photo lab, and he'd have the slides in a packet, and I would sit while he was at work and I'd cut them up and put them into little slide frames, and we'd have a family evening where we sat in front of a slide projector and we we watched the photographs that we had taken, and I think we probably had a 10% hit rate, but it was still, quite good days. So we mustn't poo-poo it too much, I guess. All right, so DSLR cameras sort of came on the market just before 2000. So Nikon was the first with its D1, and then Canon had its 10D. And, we went from a scenario where we had limited storage, 24 or 36 exposures, to almost unlimited storage. So where we are today is your compact flash cards and your SanDisk. SD cards are anything between sort of 1 gig and 64 gigs. As an example, a 32 gig card will allow you to take over 600 exposures at 20 megs per exposure. So on a card that size, you can make sure that you can just take as many photos as you want. I have a problem with my son, who has never lived through the non-digital era, and he tends to fill up 32 gig cards in half a morning himself. So it still is a problem. All right, and then just processing speeds. This is the latest Canon. It's an EOS 1D X Mark III. It's basically stronger than most of the computers that we use in terms of processing power. And it's 21.4 megapixels, 20 frames per second at 20 megs per photograph, up to 1,000 frames. So that means you can take 1,000 photos at 20 frames per second at 20 megs. It's quite outrageous. It boggles the mind, the processing speed. Mike, I don't know what Canon camera you use. Is it 1D or a 5D?
I'm just drooling at that photograph you've posted there. I would love one of those. I still have the Mark IIs, so a 1DX Mark II, and yeah, it's also a phenomenal piece of equipment.
Right. Okay. So the trends, what we found, and Dave made reference to this, is that you have this sort of spectrum of birders turning into photographers, photographers turning into birders. And a little bit of a mix in the middle, and I'm a very firm believer that the two are very easily mixed, although there are circumstances in which they don't mix so well. And I specifically chose this photograph. It's a Kupka's screech owl, which is essentially a Peruvian and Ecuadorian nocturnal bird. And I was in Peru on a trip with a good mate, and we were owling, and owling's definitely not one of my favorite pastimes. I like to sit and have a beer after days birding. And we were looking for owls, and we were lucky enough to find this bird. And I took my photographs, which included this one, which I was very satisfied with. But our guide continued to photograph this bird for probably another 25 or 30 minutes. And not only does it cause some degree of damage to the bird's eyesight, having a spotlight in the flash, but it also made me late for dinner. So there is definitely a bit of a conflict between birders and photographers, and particularly in touring groups. So it's just something that's come up as birding has changed and as photography has changed. And it kind of leads me on to the next point, which is the cameras versus binoculars debate. There are a lot of birders out there nowadays that are birding without binoculars. And to me, that probably does signal something that's a little bit, I think, a bit sad, because you tend to lose the ability to note features in the field. So what you tend to rely on is the photograph back in the office behind your computer to then notice the field identification features, and you probably don't learn as much as you do if you've got a pair of binoculars hung around your neck. So it is a trend that's there, and I think there's some superb birders who do just photograph birds without binoculars, but I think it's more an exception than a rule. Mike, I assume you keep your binoculars firmly around your neck, eh?
Well, they definitely on the car seat next to me, or also around my neck. Yeah, I think there is something lost when your brain is working through camera settings and trying to get the exposure right. You aren't necessarily fully in the moment observing the bird. And I think something is lost in terms of bird observation. So it's good to spend some time with the binoculars as well.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, for me, on some of the trips I've done, and lucky enough to be on, I have got to a point where if a good bird tends to sit on a branch, I want to make sure I get a good view through the binoculars before I lift my camera. And I have made the mistake in the past where I've lifted my camera before the binoculars and the bird has disappeared. And I've regretted not seeing it through the binoculars first. So I think if you want to keep those field skills and be attuned to what the birds are doing, I think it's much easier to see them and find them through the binoculars and then look for the photographic shot. All right, and then I just use these two photos to illustrate how photography is just incredible in terms of helping us identify birds, and sometimes after the fact. I mean, these are two birds that we see in Southern Africa. Common swift, not so common in the Western Cape, but it's a common migrant up in the north. We see them occasionally down here in the Cape, and we tend to not be believed by our birding colleagues when we say we've seen a common swift. So the best way to deal with that difficulty is to make sure you take a photograph. So this bird at the top was photographed at the white wagtail twitch, where there was a nice flock of common swifts, whereas African black swift is a very common swift here in the mountains. And you can see the ability to actually pick up the identification features of the bird. So we hear in the field guides that common swift has got a nice uniform mantle and back, and it merges into the wings and particularly the secondaries, whilst African black swift has got a very dark mantle, and then it's got these sort of silvery secondaries, and the contrast is very noticeable. And that's a good example of where I was photographing swifts and maybe not that sure which ones I was photographing, but it's good to document these things and see them in the camera. And maybe another little interesting feature on the top slide is the length of those two end primaries of the common swift. And if you look at the African black swift, it doesn't have the same length primaries. And that's probably something I never would have noticed if I was just looking through binoculars. So there's definitely an enhancement to birding skills, even with the camera, or particularly with the camera. All right, so let's just talk about equipment. And I'm going to spin through this. This is not my field of expertise, but there are essentially 4 different camera types, and we've got the DSLR, which we've spoken about. There's a huge growth in mirrorless cameras, and I've chosen 2 sort of photographs there showing the difference between DSLR and mirrorless. Mirrorless is essentially an electronic image that gets projected either on a screen or through the viewfinder, whereas on a DSLR camera, you're actually looking through an optical viewfinder. So you're actually looking through the lens at the bird sitting on a branch. Whereas what the mirrorless cameras are doing is it's taking that image, it's putting it onto a sensor, and then the sensor is converting that image onto an electronic viewfinder or an electronic LED screen. So the mirrorless cameras are relatively recent. They've sort of been born out of the point and shoots and the bridge cameras. Point and shoots are really the very basic cameras that you'll take just to take record shots. Bridge cameras have got internal zooms, and then mirrorless cameras are available with interchangeable lenses. So those bottom 3 bullets are essentially the same kind of mechanic, but just more advanced with the mirrorless camera. And I think the biggest shortcoming on the electronic viewfinders is the speed at which the camera converts that image on the sensor to an image on the viewfinder. And so the mirrorless cameras are really up there nowadays, but I think there's still a slight discrepancy between the ability to take flight shots and action shots when you're looking through a mirrorless camera and a DSLR. Mike, you have some views on that?
Yeah, I think for me, definitely the digital SLR has that, what you're looking at, you're actually looking at what's happening and you're seeing the action immediately and you're seeing the light as it is. And I think the focus acquisition time, how long it takes to lock onto a subject, is very important. Some of the higher end mirrorless cameras are tracking very well now, but there are some issues with what you're seeing through the viewfinder, what it looks like, knowing what the end result will be with what you've seen there, and that little bit of delay to get that focus locked on. But they are improving, and yeah, we'll have to watch the space and see how it develops. I don't want to knock them too hard because I was very skeptical about moving from film to digital in the beginning, and boy, was I wrong there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the big advantage with the mirrorless cameras is the size and the weight. I think that's where they're really going. And with the processing speeds, they definitely are getting very close to the DSLRs. So we we know that Canon versus Nikon is a very emotive topic, and we've absolutely decided to avoid it at all costs, except to say that Canon's probably just a little bit better. And then there's the full frame versus a crop sensor, and without being too technical, is that some DSLR cameras have got a crop sensor, which means if you look at the diagram below, that when the image is projected onto the sensor, the sensor is a little bit smaller than it is with a full frame sensor, and you get this crop effect. So it's mostly about 1.4 times. So if you take a 300 millimeter lens, you're going to get 300 times 1.4, you're going to get a 420 millimeter lens. So I think it's really helps with the more affordable side of things, is that you can get more magnification with a slightly cheaper lens. You don't have to go buy a 400 millimeter, you can buy a 300, and with the crop sensor you're getting that. There's definitely a decline in quality. The full frame sensors are generally the very expensive cameras, and you generally get that croppability when you're actually in the post-processing room. So throughout my birding and photography life, I've used a camera that has a crop sensor. I've never moved onto a full frame sensor, but probably would like to. And I think, Mike, you've used a full frame for a long time.
Yeah, I use the full frame, but some of the crop sensors are very, very good for birding. In the Canon range, the 7D Mark II is very impressive. It's just that they pack a lot more pixels into a smaller space. So sometimes in your very low light situations, where you have to bump up the ISO a little bit, you can see it becomes grainy a bit quicker than it would on the full frame cameras. So it's got something to do with how many pixels they're cramming in there, the quality of the pixels. But it still does a very good job where there's good light.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think it's the loss of quality because of the amount of cramming of those pixels. All right, so when it comes to lenses, it's the sky's the limit. We're not going to pretend that these things aren't expensive. So we may not be talking to everybody who can necessarily afford the top end lenses, but maybe just for me, I'm currently using a 100-400 f5.6, and it's a phenomenal lens for the amount that you pay for it. The quality is outstanding. It's nice and flexible, and it's pretty light. The 300 f4 was the very first camera lens that I had. It did a good job, but I think it's been overtaken predominantly by the 400 millimeter f5.6, which is a non-image stabilized lens, which is probably the most affordable lens. And I fear that it may not be currently being produced. I think it might only be available secondhand, because I couldn't find it on any of the retailers' websites. So my son uses a 400 f5.6, and it weighs virtually nothing. And it's a very affordable lens because it doesn't have image stabilizer. And then at the top end, you've got the lenses like the 400 DO, very light lens for a great magnification. And then Mike, you're using the 600 f4, which kind of, as you say, needs a little bit of chiropractic work.
Yeah, you definitely need to factor in the physio bills for that one as well.
Yeah, so I mean, converters is something that I've used, 1.4 times converter and 2 times converter, but you lose so much quality, in my opinion. I prefer to stick to a camera without a converter. All right, so we've spoken about top. Yes, Dave.
Sorry, there's a quick question here from Mario. He's asking, how many stops does a full frame really give you over a crop sensor in terms of ISO? Any views on that, Michael?
Answer that one. Yeah, I think using a 7D, I would very reluctantly want to go over an ISO 800. But I certainly will if I need to get a sharp image in poor light. But I prefer to stick under 800 ISO on a 7D, whereas I often will start at 1600 on my 1D. So it's quite a significant difference in terms of quality, in terms of how quickly the image starts to look grainy. But the other difficulty is you are you're further away from the bird, so often you'll have to crop more with your full frame camera than you would with a 7D, and that also comes into it. Maybe just to mention on the teleconverters, Mike, I think if you've got a stationary subject, sometimes you get a better result with the 1.4 times teleconverter if the object is stationary. But if you're wanting to quickly track something that moves, it slows your autofocus down. So I prefer not to use them because something might happen very quickly, and you want to lock on focus very quickly. So I prefer to crop afterwards, like you do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the experience that I've had. I've found that when you're taking flight shots, having a converter, you're losing an f-stop for starters, and then your acquisition speed is just so much slower. And I personally don't think it's worth it. But as you say, if you're sitting in a hide and you're taking photographs of birds sitting on a tree, I think it works very well. Right, so tripods, I don't use a tripod. My setup is light enough, but I think if you're going to be getting onto something that's a little heavier, and particularly if you're sitting in one place and you're happy to sit in a hide, but for a lot of the photography that I've done where it's quite mobile, it is quite cumbersome to carry a tripod. Right, and then this is a whole nother 3-hour webinar, and I'm definitely not the person to speak about it. Flash photography is really tough with birding. It gives you so many more options, but it requires a lot of knowledge of the settings of not only the camera, but also the flash. But you can get really nice sharp images. This is a red and white Aperture in Peru. And without a flash, I wouldn't have got anything close to as good a quality an image as this. But it really is another whole range of discussions to have around flash photography, just to say that it's probably for the more advanced end of photographers. And then this was thrown in just as a little bit of a laugh. We don't see too many of these in South Africa, but it's pretty popular in the US. And I think we're probably a bit more relaxed about keeping ourselves concealed in South Africa. We don't tend to camouflage ourselves in something like that little tent that's shown there. And I worried when I grabbed this picture off the internet that there'd be a gun barrel sticking out the side of that, which would definitely not have gone well in this particular webinar. All right, so we're going to move on to settings. And I apologize if it seems we're rushing through some of the technical stuff, but it's not the fun bit necessarily, but you can always go back and have a look at the slides and you can get all the information. I think the point I wanted to make here is that if you're a first buyer of a DSLR camera, when you first turn it on and you look at that LCD screen and the number of settings, it'll absolutely blow your mind as to how many settings there really are. So what I've tried to do when I've put this together is to say, let's distill it down to the 5 settings and the 5 variables that I really have used over the last 15, 20 years of photographing. So those are aperture, shutter speeds, ISO exposure, and the RAW versus JPEG. Those are the things that I really concern myself of when I'm out in the field photographing. Mike, do you want to maybe just talk about how you can use custom settings to get to those things a little quicker?
Yeah, I think it makes your life a lot easier if you've got some of the important ones there on, so you can scroll very quickly through them. I have my camera set up so that I can, with the one dial, if I scroll it, it changes the aperture, and the bottom dial on the back of the camera changes whether I'm over or under exposing. So that's nice to have some of those settings customized so that you can do them on the fly. The other one I like changing quickly is which autofocus points, or whether you're using a single point or a group, because that often helps you get a better keeper rate if you're using the right autofocus points. Just to mention those first 3 that you've got there, the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, those 3 kind of go together in terms of getting the right exposure.
Absolutely.
They're the 3 musketeers of getting your exposure right, and changing one can affect the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm going to go into each one of those and try and talk about how they relate to one another. Very simply, the aperture of a camera or a lens is the size of the hole that lets the light in. So the more expensive lenses have got very large apertures, and the cheaper lenses are generally the smaller apertures, and it's a bit of a strange one. The higher the number, the lower the size of the hole. So an f2.8 lens, which I'm showing you on the right hand side there, that 300 f2.8, that has a larger hole than the f5.6, and essentially the bigger the hole is, the more glass that needs to be put into building the lens, and therefore the heavier and the more expensive the lens becomes. But you know, if you have a large aperture, it lets in a lot of light, and you tend to be able to take photographs at a much faster shutter speed. And shutter speed is very key in terms of exposing an image in a sharp manner. So when we talk about aperture priority, and I have, through my photography life, photographed most of my subjects using what's called aperture priority, which is where you set the aperture and the camera adjusts the shutter speed in order to get the exposure right. So it says, okay, I've got a very large hole which lets in the light. I therefore don't need to open the shutter that long in order to get the right amount of light to expose the image. And so generally, as a bird photographer, you want to be photographing bird subjects with as higher amount of light that you can get through the aperture. So you want to set your aperture as large as possible, which means you want to set it as low a number as possible. So f2.8 aperture is a much more effective photographic mechanism than an f13. So if you're at f13, your hole is very small, the amount of light it's letting is minimal, and therefore it needs to expose for much longer through the shutter speed opening, and therefore there's much more chance that you're going to get a blurred image because your camera is shaking. So that's kind of the relationship. We'll get onto ISO in a sec. Mike, have I described that in a clumsy way, or is that more or less right?
Well, I was going to say that you might get the right exposure, but you're not going to freeze action. So the higher your aperture, or the quicker you take the picture, the more you're going to freeze action. And obviously, as you say, the more light you let in, the quicker you get the amount of light that you need for the correct exposure. But many people don't use aperture priority as well. The other option is to set the right speed and let the camera decide. You know, if you're wanting to freeze action, using that priority is also okay. But I think if you were photographing a lot of other things before, many of us got used to using aperture priority because it's one of the areas where you're doing creative things. So the bigger the hole that you're using, in other words, if you're using f2.8, your depth of field gets affected. And that's where you start to do creative things as well, if you're wanting to blur backgrounds. And you also need to be mindful of not having too shallow a depth of field as well. So I think there's, you know, both have merit. Many people will set their shutter speed, and others will focus more on their aperture priority in terms of getting it as much as they want to get in focus with the depth of field.
Yeah, I think I was about to move on to depth of field, and I think the one sacrifice you have with your large apertures is you get what's called a very narrow depth of field, which essentially means that if you've focused on a subject in the foreground, it's very likely that the items in the background are going to be blurred. And that's not necessarily always a good thing in some kinds of photography, but I mean, if you just have a look at these two images that were taken at f4, which is a relatively large aperture, you get very sharp image of the bird in the foreground, and you specifically want the background to be blurred or to be non-cluttered. So if you had a greater, a smaller aperture, you have a deeper depth of field, and therefore things in the background start coming into focus. And we'll show you, particularly in an image like this. So Mike, maybe just talk about this photograph, which was taken at f8.
So yeah, I opened it.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Maybe just I should have labeled these. It's a grey-headed kingfisher on the left, and then an aplomado falcon on the right, which is a South American bird. Sorry, I'm going to name the birds as we go. I think people probably would want to know.
For sure. Yeah, this one's a curlew sandpiper. One of the other things that you need to be mindful of with depth of field is how close you are to the bird. So birds that are closer to you, it's important that you maybe stop down a bit, so that you get more depth of field, so that you have more of the bird in focus. Otherwise, you might have pieces in the foreground and the background out of focus that are actually part of your subject.
Yeah, I think in this image, I think it's a classic example. You've got the wing that's in the foreground, that is sharply in focus, and the wing in the background is also sharply in focus, and so is the head and the eye. And I think the eye being in focus in bird photography is probably the most important part that's got to be in focus. But you wanted to freeze the two wings, and bearing in mind that the bird is sort of laterally to you, they're at different distances to where you were sitting. So if you were using f2.8 on this image, or f4, you probably would find that the eye would be in focus, but both the wings would be sort of out of focus, and that's not the effect that you're trying to create.
I often find that the wing's in focus and everything else is out of focus. Very frustrating.
Yeah, I think I made the comment about the eye. Using focal points, you talked about using focal dots. I always use a single focal dot, well, not always, but most of the time. And that focal dot should always be positioned on the eye of the bird as much as possible, because that gives you the best chance of getting the eye in focus, and then the rest kind of follows from there. All right, so then we've kind of spoken a lot about shutter speed already, and I think the shutter speed, it's fairly obvious. The longer the shutter is open, the more light the camera lets in. The problem is that if you have poor light and you have a relatively small aperture, the shutter's got to be left open for a long time. And the longer that you leave the shutter open, the more likely it is that you're going to move the camera, and you're going to get blurred and shaky images. So I think cameras that have got very large apertures are the expensive cameras, and that's why they're called faster lenses. Essentially, you can get better images with a faster shutter speed. So, I think one of the things I've found is that shutter speed priority works very well when you know you've got good light, and you want to make sure that you get a very fast shutter speed in order to freeze action. So this Southern Royal Albatross, the bird's flying at quite a pace, and when you lock your focus on it, you want to make sure that you're going to freeze the images as well as you can, and that's the effect that's created here. So because there's such good light, it's likely that the aperture was a little bit smaller, and therefore you've got a bit more depth of field in this particular photo, with most of the wing and the eye of the bird in focus.
Yeah, Mike, I think we can maybe ask Dave if there are any questions as well. I think with the bigger birds, I'd like to say that I often use a single point focus, or single point with 4 assisting focus points. But with smaller birds moving around in the frame, like with swifts, for example, it's often better to use as many of those points as you can.
Yes, as you say, you get less throwaway shots then. Dave, are there any questions that are popping up?
So that was in fact one question, Michael. I'm not sure if you read that on the chat, but someone is asking if you move the single focus point around in the frame to meet the eye.
Yes, so I will often, depending on what's happening in the frame, or if it's a large bird like this albatross that's in flight, I will actually not have the center point. I will actually move the autofocus group slightly to the right, so that I can keep it on the eye and still have the albatross, the whole picture in your frame, but the focus point is still on the eye. So moving autofocus points around is something that I do a lot of, and I think the more you do it on the fly, the quicker it happens. But I also, you might be photographing a larger bird, and then suddenly there's a swift or something you want to photograph, and then just changing to using more autofocus points will help a lot. But yes, you certainly can move them around. Some of the camera bodies have a little lever at the back, and if you can set it so that while you're photographing on something, you can move that lever and move the autofocus point in the frame to where you want it. One of the new cameras even has the new 1D Mark III has a sensor where you just move your thumb along and on the focus button, so you can just move your thumb along and it will move the autofocus point to where you want it while you're shooting.
Sure, Michael.
Yeah,
I mean that you must really be pretty handy at moving that sensor around. Um, there's another question about if either of you ever use auto ISO.
Yeah, auto ISO is a very useful function if your camera has it. I'm sure we're going to talk about ISO just now, but certainly I would rather have a sharp, grainy shot than have a fuzzy shot without grain. You want to be able to get a sharp image of the subject, especially if the subject's moving. And it's nice not to have to think about the ISO. If your camera does that for you, it will bump the ISO up to whatever it needs to be and keep it as low as possible if the light allows.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that's where ISO. We'll talk about ISO in a sec, but you really want to get the shots off, and you want it to be in focus rather than worry about the graininess. And we'll talk about grain in a second. I mean, Mike, this is an amazing shot you took, and I mean, it kind of throws everything together. It shows that beautiful gray background, which is obviously a slightly overcast sky. You've got your exposure 100% right, and you've just frozen that wing absolutely perfectly. It's a classic example of the right mix of shutter speed, aperture, and exposure.
It's tricky with birds with black and white together. They do pose quite a few challenges. But if you have to choose one over the other, make sure that you get your whites better and rather have the dark areas lifted out later. You don't want to blow out your highlights if you can help it.
Yeah, I think that's a point I'm going to talk about in a second. So, but yeah, absolutely beautiful shot, and there's nothing trickier than photographing a black and white bird and getting it all right, and you've nailed that one. It's an amazing shot. I spoke about this. If you have a very slow shutter speed, your chances of getting the birds blurred is tricky. I generally find that if you're at 1/50th of a second, if it's handheld, you're going to do well to get the bird in focus. This photograph of what's called a Kivu ground thrush in Uganda was taken at 100th of a second. And fortunately the bird sat still, and I was able to hold the camera still enough to get the shot, but it's not easy to do so at those very slow shutter speeds. And then this is really just tying the aperture and the shutter speed all together. It is possible to use the manual setting, and that's where auto ISO comes into being as well. You can set your shutter speed at, let's say, 3,000th of a second, and you want to photograph at f7, f8, or f5.6, and you will then let your camera adjust the ISO in order to get the right exposure. So it's very useful when you're photographing pelagic birds like this southern fulmer, where you want to set your shutter speed really nice and high so that you get that frozen image, and then just let your ISO adjust. Fortunately, the light in this circumstance was good enough that the ISO didn't have to go too high, but it's a very good skill to use, is to get that, to sit on a pelagic boat and say, I want to photograph at 2,500ths of a second or 6,000ths of a second, and I want to have f5.6, and then let your camera do the adjustment through the ISO. And I think that brings us on to ISO. It's essentially in the old expressions, it was the ASA, which is the speed of the film. You'll forgive these photographs because these were taken a couple of days ago in our lounge. You can see on the photograph on the left, ISO of 100 at f5.6, 0.4 of a second. And you basically, you can see our dog Bella, she's a little bit blurred there. It's hard to handhold at 0.4 of a second. But then I bumped up the ISO to 3,200. And all of a sudden I had a 60th of a second. So that ratio is quite phenomenal. So you've increased the ISO by 32 times, and you've probably increased your shutter speed by a very similar proportion. And it's a really nice cheat. You can be out in the field and you can be in a dark forest, and you can bump up that ISO as high as you want in order to make sure you get a good shutter speed. And these are just a few examples. Here's a 1250 shutter speed. This is a fork-tailed wood nymph, which is one of the hummingbirds. And you're getting 1,250th of a second, which is really sufficient in order to to freeze a bird perched in a branch. And then this is even more extreme. This is a black-faced antbird. And you can see 6,400 ISO is enormous. And it was a 40th of a second, so you can just imagine how dark it was. But if you look at the sort of zoomed in image on the right, you can see all that grain coming through in the actual image. And this goes back to what Mike said. I'd rather have had this image at all rather than not having the image because I was fixated on shooting at 800 ISO. So it's a very good example of where ISO really helps. And you can actually denoise in post-processing, and we'll talk about that next week. So I won't go into it now. And then you have situations where the grain is definitely worth it, because this green-breasted pitter was photographed in virtual darkness. So you're getting 8,000 ISO, which is making it very grainy, but at least you're getting a relatively sharp image.
Yeah, Mark, I think a lot of us go out birding very early. So I often will set my camera before I leave to a fairly high ISO. And then as dawn arrives and the light starts to improve, you're continually dropping your ISO as things get brighter. But I would rather have a sharp, grainy picture, very definitely, over a picture that isn't sharp.
Yeah, or no image at all, because the camera can't.
Or no image at all.
Yeah. All right, and we've spoken about exposure, and essentially your exposure is what the camera thinks is the right amount of light to expose the image. And sometimes the camera actually doesn't know that you're photographing a European honey buzzard, where you really want to get some details in the underwings. It's looking at the average light of the whole frame, and it's saying, well, there's great light because it's bright. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed my shutter up, so I only take in enough light to expose the image correctly. But what then ends up happening is that your image, your actual subject being the honey buzzard, ends up being underexposed. And then the reverse scenario is a bird like this southern royal albatross again, where it's surrounded by a dark ocean. The camera says it's actually quite dark, therefore I'm going to I'm going to slow my shutter speed down so I can get enough light. And then you get this effect of blowing the whites, which Mike referred to. And if you're going to try get anything right, is to try get the whites right rather than overexposing the whites, because that's something you can never really get back in post-processing. You can always lighten the darks, but you can never bring back blown whites.
Yeah, Mike, one easy way that I remember it is that if I think the picture is very dark, because relative to my subject, I make it darker. If the background looks very bright, you make it brighter.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the point. So,
because,
sorry, Mike, I interrupted.
No, that's it might seem counterintuitive, but your camera thinks it's dark and it's going to make it too bright. So when the background's dark, you make it darker, and if the background is bright, you make it brighter.
So what you'll have to just park for the meantime is those two particular images that I've shown you. Next week, when we talk about processing, I'm going to show a few techniques in which you can essentially lighten the underwings of the honey buzzard, and you can bring those whites a little bit less bright, and you can get a little bit of texture in the white feathers in the southern royal albatross.
Mike Ruloff makes a good point as well. You know, there are two ways that you can check whether you're overexposing or blowing out your highlights. The one is, many cameras have a function where you can turn on the blinkies, where you can turn on a function that shows you that your highlights are overblown. It flashes in the image that you look at the back of the camera. It will flash on the areas that are blown out, or you can look at your histogram. But I think the easiest for the guys just starting out is to just turn on that setting that shows you, it flashes when you look at the image, it flashes which areas are too bright. And then you just need to make sure you underexpose it a bit.
Yeah, maybe to just explain that. So when you view your image, after you've photographed it on your LED screen on the back of your camera, there's a setting where the overblown whites actually blink black. And that tells you that you've blown your whites. And I remember going to a photographic workshop many, many years ago, and I was told that you can never, ever bring back blown whites. Once the whites are so blown, it means that the data in those pixels is gone. There is no way to bring back those pixels. And so you want to make sure that you don't blow the whites. And it's what I've found over the years is I tend to stop down a little bit. And what that means is, in this little chart that I'm showing here, is you adjust your exposure to tell your camera, just underexpose everything a little bit. So moving that arrow down towards -1 stop or -2 stops, or even 2/3 of a stop, just makes a big difference in making sure that you don't blow those whites. But having said that, when you're photographing raptors overhead, you actually want to move the exposure to the right, where it makes your images lighter, so you get some more detail on those feathers. But a lot of that can be actually achieved in post-processing, except for when your lights are completely blown.
Yeah.
All right, and then this page is for you all to go back and look in a little bit more detail when you have time. There's the never-ending debate about whether you shoot in RAW or JPEG. So very basically, RAW is basically a minimally processed amount of data in the image file. So the camera has, and the processor in the camera has done nothing to the pixels that have been recorded on the file. Whereas a JPEG, the camera and the processor has actually partially compressed the image that you've taken. So it's done a little bit of work to that image and the pixels, and it's got you some way towards having an image that you can just use as it is, rather than having to go through a processing set of steps. So there are advantages of RAW and disadvantages of RAW, and I've listed them over there. But the bottom line is, for me, and I might have some photographic mates who will disagree here, if you have intentions of publishing images in high quality magazines, so glossy magazines and published field guides or books or coffee table books, then I suggest you take your photographs in RAW, because the publisher will always ask you for your RAW image, and then they do the adjustments themselves. But if you're taking photographs for your own enjoyment and to view in Instagram and Facebook, then I certainly would take photographs in JPEG. The big difference obviously is amount of storage space. So if you're taking photographs in RAW with a 32 gig card, you'll probably get about 1,500 photographs or exposures. But if you're taking it with JPEG, you'll probably get 7,000 or 8,000 exposures. So if you're not into using a lot of storage space, then JPEG is your answer. Yeah, and I think the more the photographs that are taken in RAW require more processing. And so if you enjoy spending time processing your images and getting the most out of them that you can, then RAW is what you need to do. Mike, any comments? Is that a fair sort of summary?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's just there's so much more data in the RAW files, but as you say, they do take up a lot of space and they take up a lot of time in terms of processing them. There's a question about exposure bracketing and whether that's useful as a way to try and compensate if you're struggling to get the exposure right. But I often don't use that. If I'm set up for a particular shot, and there's going to be one image, one branch where I'm hoping the kingfisher returns to or flies back to, I might use exposure bracketing in that setting, but too often I find the nuisance of having all the extra files difficult.
Maybe just to explain, exposure bracketing is not something I've ever used, but the way I understand it is that every time you take an image, what the camera does is it takes 3 images, one that is slightly underexposed, one that's correctly exposed, and one that is slightly overexposed. So you end up having 3 images where you can choose which one is best. Is that right?
Yeah, that's basically it. I think when we had less chance to go and do it again, or less opportunity to rescue shots in the past, it was very useful. But I think that, it's so easy to lift out the dark areas in post-processing these days that if you're slightly off, you can still rescue a lot of images.
Agreed. And we'll talk about processing next week. All right, so this
Mike,
is the... Sorry, Dave?
There's also a quick question about spot metering, whether we use it much or rely more on exposure compensation.
Yeah, I was thinking of mentioning that the way your camera measures exposure, there are different ways: evaluative, center weighted, and spot metering. And spot metering is great if you've got a subject and you want to meter on that specific subject. But what do you do with subjects that have like the black-winged stilt that have white and black. It just depends where your focus point ends up, whether it exposes for the white or the black. So sometimes it's tricky to use spot metering, but it can be another way to get the metering of the subject correct, regardless of what the background looks like.
Yeah, I think just once again, sorry, just to explain for probably my benefit more than anyone else, is spot metering essentially is a way that you can tell your camera to actually read the light on the part of the image that you are wanting detail on. So in that European honey buzzard, if your focal point was on the dark breast of the honey buzzard, the camera would say, well, let's expose for that darkness rather than look at the image as a whole. And expose based on the average light of the whole image. So in that sense, I think taking flight shots of raptors overhead, spot metering probably would work quite well. But as you say, with that black-winged stilt, it's not going to work at all because it depends where your focal point is.
Yeah, and I think also the big thing is the more of these settings you change, as soon as you change from shooting that bird in the sky to shooting a bird down below, it can be useful there. Because it will still be metering on that particular spot. But one thing that you must always remember is to just reset your camera settings to a neutral point after you've changed exposure or changed any of these settings. Always remember to go back. Otherwise, everything's set up for one situation and then you quickly into a next situation and things don't work.
Agreed. All right, so the bit that I think is just a little bit of, it's not technical, it's just a little bit of feel and experience. And this is where we hope to bring some interesting tips. So I've categorized it into those topics. And I mean, I think there's always a little bit of amusement when Michael is involved. Mike, do you want to maybe talk us through these images?
Yeah, the most
that is raw sewage that you basically down to your thighs in, isn't it?
Yeah, that's just outside Harare, and unfortunately their sewage network sewage systems aren't working as well as they used to, so most of the sewage runs down the river to the dam. And I'd gone up to photograph a spur-winged lapwing before we had one pitch up in Port Elizabeth. And I looked at that patch of sand and thought it would be a safer place to stand than the mud or before it, and it turned out not to be sand. It turned out to be rather more like sinking sand, and perhaps not sand. It is a bit of sewage.
But what I really love is that once you were in it, you were going to stay there until you got the right shot, and that's kind of the results that you're going to get when you show a little bit of determination.
The most hurtful thing, Mike, was that my guide was taking photographs and laughing rather than coming to my assistance.
I think he deserved to enjoy the moment. Right, and then understanding behavior is a very important aspect of photographing birds in the field. So, I mean, this is a pretty basic way to understand behavior. If you know there's a bird with a nest, it's a great place to stand and wait for the bird to come back to the nest and feed the chicks. So this is an African paradise flycatcher in Kirstenbosch. And this nest was fortunately at a reasonable height. And it does go to show that you can chop off the tail of a bird and still be reasonably happy with the image. This is a bat hawk in Beira in Mozambique. And it was nest building. So you can see the photograph on the left was carrying a stick to build its nest. And then it would return to this crook in the tree. And so if you position yourself where the bird's returning to, you end up getting some nice images. And once again, you don't have to have the whole bird in the image to have a decent result. It's nice to sometimes get something a little bit different. And Mike's a very good creative photographer, so we'll show some of his stuff next week when we come to creative photography. And then Mike, I was with you when you took this photograph. And this was a very special morning of bird photography, and it just shows how rewarding can be. Maybe just talk about this.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience. I think one of the things that really make this hobby a lot of fun is when you are basically sitting still and watching the birds' behavior, and the birds are comfortable with you. They come to you. They're comfortable around you. And it was such a special morning. The light was great, and this father was feeding a young fledgling, and it would just come and collect food all around us and go back to feed the youngster. So if you sat still and photographed the youngster or kept your eye on the youngster, every time he came back, you could get a few shots of him being fed.
Yeah, it's a great image, and it once again goes back to that beautiful background where it's nice and soft, that kind of tan color. Your white rock isn't blown; the whites aren't blown in that white rock, and you've frozen the moment as the bird's opened its beak to receive the insect. So it's a really special image, that one. This one is not a particularly sharp image, but we were watching a marshal at Britflay, and it would occasionally dive down into the grass in order to grab a mouse or a mole. And so it's just a matter of understanding where to stand in order to get the right sort of focus and light on the bird. And then this is one of the most important aspects of bird photography is illuminating the subject. And we need light to illuminate the bird that we're photographing. But it doesn't always have to be directly from behind. And I did receive a tip from a very experienced photographer many years ago, and he said that the best light you can get is if the line of your shadow actually points to the bird that you're photographing. So where the light is directly behind, and that allows you to avoid any shadows in the bird. You can actually see the shadow of the bird on the right-hand side of the image, at the bottom right there. I think that's the shadow of the bird, but here you can see the light directly on the bird does bring up the colors very well. Side lighting is also quite useful. It creates a little bit of depth. So that grey-winged francolin on the left and the burrowing owl on the right. Early morning sun on the burrowing owl, and you kind of get a little bit of mood and a bit of depth, and it creates a different effect than if the light had been directly on the bird. And backlit photos. It's always a big no-no to take photographs of birds where the sun is behind the bird. But if it's at the right angle and you get a nice soft background, you can get these amazing effects where there's almost that sort of halo effect around the edging of the feathers of the bird. And this black-chested puffbird has got that beautiful sort of whitening on the back of the neck. And the Cape pendulum tit has got those belly feathers and the breast feathers just illuminated nicely. And the bird is still sufficiently exposed that you can see the feather detail on the front. And then photographing in the shade. I'm a big fan of photographing birds in the shade, Mike. And this orange-breasted bushshrike that you photographed in Kruger is a good example of that. You get beautiful feather detail.
I think one of the things that I've learned about iridescent birds is that they are certainly easier to photograph in the shade, or where you don't have direct light on them. So especially where there's some iridescence. This one was also in the shade, although it's not particularly an iridescent bird, but sunbirds and are much easier where you don't have direct, or the glossy starlings, for example, often easier to get richer colors and better exposed pictures if they are not in the direct sunshine.
Yeah, although, I think that's, sorry, Mark.
Yeah, I think, if a photographer prefers to have the sun behind him over one of his shoulders, but there are situations where a bird in the shade is easier to photograph. Yeah,
I think you make an incredible point there about iridescent birds. I had never really thought about it, but bright sunshine on iridescence often causes that overexposure. And if you get sufficient light in the shade on those birds, it really does produce some amazing results. Yes, Dave.
Sorry, there's a question just asking you to explain the concept of blowing a color. If you could just explain that again, and then also just continue to name the birds, please.
I apologize. Okay, I will do so. Did we forget a name somewhere along the line? Black-chested puffbird and a Cape pendulum tit. And then here we've got an orange-breasted bushshrike. Yeah, Dave, I think the concept of blowing colors, I think I'm only familiar with the concept of blowing the whites. And what that means is where there's a lot of white on the bird, if your exposure is too high, if you take in too much light in order to expose the bird, and it often happens with birds that are predominantly dark and then they have some white on them, the camera will adjust to take in enough light to expose the darker colors, and that amount of light will be too much for the white in the actual subject. And what that tends to do is it causes such a high overexposure of those whites that the camera isn't able to cope with that amount of white, and it causes a loss of data in the pixels that are associated with those white colors. And once the white is blown, and as Mark referred to the histogram or those blinkies, when you've blown those whites, when you post-process, you can never get feather texture back where there are white colors in a bird's feathers. If you don't blow the whites, even if it looks quite bright white, you can always bring it back by using a particular variable, which is actually called whites. You actually reduce the amount of exposure on the whites, and that brings back some feather texture, because that's really what you want to see. You want to see the texture in the feathers of the bird. I hope that answers. We can't ask our respondent if it's enough, but hopefully that covers it. This is just another example of the great effects you can get in the shade. This is an Andean cock of the rock in Peru. And, you know, even though there's not bright sunshine on these beautiful oranges and that nice gray on the back of the bird, and the dark feathers and the orange legs, you're still getting such a nice, rich color when you take photographs of birds in the shade. And I think that's the point Mark was also trying to make, is those iridescence on sunbirds and hummingbirds and glossy starlings comes out so beautifully when the birds are in the shade. Mike, you're a fan of silhouetted photographs. I'm not particularly good myself.
Yeah, sometimes if you're out very early and you are in a situation where you've got backlighting, it's an opportunity to try and be a little more creative. Obviously, you know, it's often not the situation you want to be in, but if you are faced with that challenge, you do your best to try and make it work. And then you really want your dark areas to be really dark. You're not particularly looking to keep the detail in the dark areas at all.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful image. That's obviously at Strandfontein.
That was at Strandfontein, and I quite enjoy how the light shines through their bills as well.
Yeah, those nasal holes. That's amazing. And then it's a similar kind of effect with these great white pelicans.
Yeah, the little light around their heads and feathers. This was actually at Veldrif, which has been the center of a lot of the rarities of late. So this was at Kliphoek, what's it?
Kliphoek salt pans, yeah.
Yeah. And it was also very, very early morning on the wrong side of the light. But it made for a nice image, especially with the reflections in the water and the soft morning light before the sunrise.
I guess one of
the... What you use, Michael?
Say again?
What settings would you use for these silhouettes?
So it would be different depending on how much light is available, but you would want to underexpose quite a bit to try and get the dark areas darker. On my camera, I have the ability to do live view as well, which essentially is you know, you can actually see the image and dial the exposure down until you're happy with where it is. Very much like you would with a mirrorless camera. So the trick with these is to underexpose and then just check, is it too much? Have I lost too much detail? But again, don't blow the highlights. So make sure that the highlights, I think because you're underexposing, you often don't blow the highlights, but definitely with these, you need to underexpose. I'm not sure exactly what the settings for this photograph was, but I think that the tip is just to keep underexposing until you feel the subjects are very dark, but that the background still shows something.
Great. All right, and this is something that my son Adam and I always talk about when we're on our way to Strandfontein on a Sunday afternoon, and we always bemoan the fact that the wind is in the wrong direction, and non-photographers wouldn't really know what we're talking about, but it really helps. Mike, this is your great Caspian turn shot. Really helps to have the wind blowing from the same direction as the sunlight is shining from, because and particularly with terns and gulls and seabirds and even waders, to have the bird. Obviously, as you know, birds use the wind to get the lift as they fly, and they'll always face into the wind when they take off. And if the wind is blowing from behind you, they're taking off towards you, and you're going to get a far better effect.
Yeah, So wind is useful in those situations, especially with birds in flight.
Absolutely, and this hot lobe skull is a good example as well. Very soft light on that particular day with a nice grey background, but the bird wouldn't have been flying towards me if the wind wasn't coming from behind. So you often just wait for those opportunities when the light and the wind are aligned, and then that's when you're going to get your best results. Mike, these are some of my favorite photographs of yours, these reflection photos. You know, different to the silhouettes because the bird is nicely exposed, but you're getting that beautiful reflection on the water.
Yeah, this was a very special moment for me. There was a pair of pectoral sandpipers at Strandfontein, and it was such a wind-still morning. One of the worst things about this lockdown is that some of the nicest days of the year in the Cape are now in the autumn, when the wind dies down. The wind blows for quite a few of our summer days. So yeah, I was looking at some of the beautiful days that we were having, and lamenting the fact that when it's wind still, I do like to go out to Strandfontein and look for the opportunity to photograph birds with reflections. I do quite enjoy taking pictures on those very, very wind still mornings.
And then I think I assume this was on the same morning, this beautiful Bartel Godwit that you photographed at Strandfontein as well.
That was also at Strandfontein. I think it was a different morning, but yeah, it's also it's nice wind still conditions. So when the wind isn't blowing, you look for reflections, and if the wind is blowing, then you look for the opportunity to photograph birds in flight.
That's a good compromise. Right, and this is something that I feel very strongly about, is background, and we've spoken a little bit about background already. So I've used a quick example here, which I think will illustrate it. So there's a white-throated bee-eater, unfortunately not photographed in Southern Africa. This was photographed in Uganda. It's by all rights a pretty cool photo of an absolutely spectacular bird. And it is taken in its habitat. You know, it does perch on these acacia trees or Vauchelia trees. I'm not sure which one we should use. But I just think when you get rid of the clutter, like the image on the right-hand side, you get the bird just stands out so much better. And I think I would have been very happy with the photo on the left, but the photo on the right definitely, I prefer that effect where you've got this nice green blurring in the background and nothing affecting your image of the bird. So great things to try and achieve in the background, and you often have to walk around the bird a little bit to change the nature of the background. He has a white-bellied korhaan in KZN, and then a Cape Canary in Kirstenbosch. Nice tan colors, nice natural colors. You know, to have a brick red wall in the background blurred is often not as good because you can see it's artificial. So here, these nice natural colors essentially make the bird pop out quite a lot more. And then in some circumstances, when the light is right, a black background can work really well. This is an Inca tern, and very difficult to get good photos of Inca tern because it lives on a coastline where it's mostly covered in mist. So this was a situation where the sun was shining nicely, and this bird was sitting on a rock with a cave behind it, and it tends to illuminate the bird so much better because of the background is black. And this is just a classic example of background. This was a sentinel rock thrush photographed just above Muizenberg. And the photograph I've showed that the light was good, my settings were good, the bird was sitting nicely, it wasn't far away, I got nice feather detail. But then I decided I would step up by a meter and see what difference that made. And so essentially it's exactly the same bird in exactly the same position, but I just changed where I was photographing it from. And instead of that sort of dull light blue sky, which tends to underexpose the bird, and even if I did lighten it in post-processing, what you'll find is that the background will become very white, and it tends to affect the image of the whole image. Whereas the one on the right-hand side, suddenly with that green background, the bird is correctly exposed, and it makes it pop out so much more.
Yeah, it's a great illustration.
Sorry, Dave?
Yeah, no, I was saying that that's a great illustration. You know, you have to keep telling yourself, don't be lazy. You know, think about the background, think about the move if you need to move. But that's a very good illustration of how the different backgrounds make a big difference to your colors.
All right, and then photographer's position. This is Michael almost in the sewage water at Strandfontein with John Graham. I noticed John is further away from the water than you were. Mike, is that because you're a bit more dedicated?
It's just respect for the elderly.
Just so you can help him back onto the bank. And if you can see in this image, it's tricky to see, but there's a barn swallow flying over the water. And essentially that's the type of image that Mike can achieve through that.
Mike, we've lost your sound.
Can you still hear me?
There, that's better.
I'm back. All right, and then I found that particularly with waders, getting right down onto the level of the bird. So if you look at this image of a sanderling, the mud is basically at eye level, and so you don't have to guess that I was lying flat on my stomach on the muddy estuary. But it's worth it to get an image like that where you get the bird at a really good perspective as to where the bird will see another species of its same kind. And Mike, this is your awesome Kitlitz's photo, Kitlitz's plover.
Yeah, and I think you always want to get as low as possible with these birds. I think it gives a very nice, a much nicer image if you sort of on that level, gives you a much nicer perspective. But I think it's also because it's different to the usual perspective. You know, I think everyone tends to photograph down from their vehicle down to a bird. So you see a lot of those images, and you want to see something different as well. It's a much nicer perspective of the bird from their level, basically.
And then that's another point you were raising with this peregrine falcon.
Yeah, sometimes you want to be above. You know, usually when we're shooting raptors, we're all shooting them from below. So to get a different image, you want to get up high. I think this was from a quarry. So I was up on the edge of the quarry, and that also enables you to get a green or a more green or brown, more neutral background rather than the blue sky. And it's again, it's just a different perspective of the bird than what we usually see.
Yeah, that's an absolutely amazing shot. Love that one. And then obviously we're familiar with raptor shots from below. It helps to get some nice early morning light, and it's a little bit side on. That helps a lot. And then just a very quick one on birds in flight. And I think the point I would make is that you've got to accept that you're going to go through a lot of card space. So this sand martin on the left-hand side, sorry, that previous shot was a batelier, but I think most people probably knew that one. So there's a sand martin on the left-hand side, and there's a Horus swift on the right. I probably took 400 to 500 exposures for the Horus swift. We were at a nest site near Jeffreys Bay, and you end up with 5 or 6 usable ones. So you've got to be prepared to go through a lot of data if you're going to be taking flight shots. And then, Mike, this is your vulture shot.
Yeah, I think, again, with positioning, if you are in a game reserve and there's a kill, you know that the vultures are going to be coming in, and if you can position your vehicle so that you can watch them coming in, it is sometimes tricky because they can come from any direction, but you want to position yourself to get the birds as they're coming into land.
All right, and then I think we don't see as many feeders in South Africa as you do in places like the United States and in South America, where they have a lot of sort of tanager and hummingbird feeders. But with lockdown birding, I've spent a lot of time. My son put up some feeders, and we've had some beautiful forest canaries coming to visit us. So there's nothing wrong with a photograph of a bird on a feeder, but it doesn't look quite as nice as a picture of the bird sitting on a natural perch. So if you are going to take pictures of birds on feeders, make sure that you've either hung up the feeder on a natural indigenous tree, or you have perches that you either put in the ground or attach to the tree that the feeder is hanging from, and you'll get your opportunity because birds get very habituated around feeders. And I think this is just an illustration of the natural feeders, the natural perches that people put out at feeders in South America. These are all photographs of birds taken at either tanager fruit feeders or hummingbird feeders. And hummingbird photography is just a completely different kettle of fish. And It's very hard to avoid the plastic that comes with the actual feeding station. So you've got to get a bit lucky or a little bit patient. This is a rufous-tailed hummingbird on the left and a rufous-crested coquette on the right-hand side. The bird on the right-hand side is probably the size of a normal human thumb. So a very difficult bird to photograph as it buzzes around the flowers. Right, and then lawn and concrete. You know, I think it depends on your own personal taste, but I particularly find that lawn doesn't look great when you're taking a photograph of a bird. But sometimes even lawn is worth having in the image when you get an opportunity to take a black sparrowhawk that's killed a red-eyed dove. In this instance, this red-eyed dove is unfortunately not dead yet. And this was taken on our lawn in our garden. So we get black sparrowhawks coming through every single day, these beautiful dark ones. And then sometimes you just got to get a record shot. So this is the famous spur-wing lapwing at Continental Tires in PE. And the photograph on my left is the normal size of the actual image that I took of this bird. So you can see sometimes you'll go to drastic lengths. And then Mike, maybe you can tell us about this particular bird where you photographed it on a man-made object.
Yeah,
don't be shy, Mike, to talk about this one.
Yes, no, I've been coerced into talking about this one. You're a bad influence, Mike. So this was a trip to Dahlstrom where I had to twist Franz Hendrik Hubert's arm. We were heading to Dahlstrom to maybe see the white-winged flufftail, which in the end nobody did. But I encouraged him that since we were flying to Johannesburg anyway, what's a short trip to Victoria Falls Airport, as this bird was hanging around in the parking lot. It's a pied wheat ear. But yes, it is a rather sort of one for the sub-region, and I plead innocence in terms of the gripping off that's going on.
You're too shy to say that there are some people that are probably listening tonight that unfortunately didn't make it all the way to Victoria Falls to see this pied wheat ear. And then sometimes it's just a case of being in the right place at the right time. So I was on my own down at Strandfontein. My sons were studying for exams, and the wind was howling gale. And I was driving along the road and I noticed a peregrine killing a speckled pigeon. And I quickly stopped and turned the car around and drove onto the pavement. And it allowed me to get remarkably close. And you have these moments where just time stands still. I sat there for probably 40 minutes photographing this peregrine from different angles. And then you end up walking away with images that you'll remember for the rest of your life. And it's one of my favorite photographic moments, this particular bird. And hence it was the title image for this particular talk. And then Mike, this is also a sequence of images which is just amazing. This is a grey-rumped swallow that you were photographing in the Kruger Park. And I'll leave you to set the scene quickly, and then I'll go on to the next image.
So grey-rumped swallow is not a bird I get to see very often in the Western Cape, and I've always been wanting to try and get a photograph of it. And you can see there I wasn't being too successful. The bird was against the sky and was difficult to get well-exposed images. And I noticed that it was collecting pieces of nesting material from a cement bridge. And I set up basically to photograph it as it came to collect a piece of grass there on the edge of the cement causeway. And as I was waiting for the bird to land, I was apparently not the only one watching it there. And it all happened in a few seconds, but I managed to get some photographs of this olive grass snape catching the swallow. I was a little annoyed that my subject was being taken, but I was happy with the photographs in the end.
Yeah, it's I mean, just this first image, you can see the left leg of the left claw of the grey-rumped swallow in the snake's neck, and then it's amazing how that snake has got hold of it on its throat.
Yeah.
It's busy killing it, and those are the final throws, I think.
Yeah, it took me at least 2 seconds to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful images. I guess technically not the best sort of composition, but that gets overtaken by having such dramatic action in the photographs, and that's something that you very, very seldom get an opportunity to achieve.
Yeah, it was the middle of the day as well, making lighting conditions very difficult, but certainly an experience I won't forget.
And then just to finish off, I know we've gone on probably much longer than everyone anticipated. But Mike, do you want to just finish off with your last story, and then I've got one to finish off myself, and then we'll sign off. So tell us about this bird, and we've
this
bird.
This bird I was actually in Mutare at the time, up in Zim.
So Mutare, Mike, you were in Mutare, which is in eastern Zimbabwe. Is that right?
Yeah, eastern Zimbabwe, and yeah, I developed kidney stones, and you know that you're in considerable trouble when you start to look at the cost of flights back home from Mutare. But in the end, I mentioned to my brother, no, we need to drive back, and we left Mutare a day early. Giving up a day's birding in Zim is a very difficult thing for me to do, but kidney stones will make you do some crazy things.
So had you heard of the black skimmer when you decided to head back?
I hadn't heard about the black skimmer. We just decided because of the kidney stones to head back a day early. And as we hit the border of South Africa and got back into cell phone range, the messages started coming through that on the previous afternoon, this black skimmer had been seen. And of course, we drove through the night and got there at dawn and got the opportunity to photograph this bird in some pretty special morning light, skimming at Rietvlei in Cape Town.
So for those of you that don't know, black skimmer, this was the first and I can say probably the only record, because it was photographed at Rietvlei. It remained probably there for a day. It was the first record for Southern Africa, and then it was seen 4 or 5 days later in Walvis Bay, and there's the strong theory that it was the same bird. But if it wasn't, it would have been a bizarre coincidence. So a very special bird for the sub-region list. Just go through. Mark, you still there?
Yes, no, it was absolutely a great slice of luck to be able to connect with this bird, because it was gone the next day. So I was very grateful for those kidney stones in the end.
That's a beautiful shot of. It's very hard to believe that if you had zoomed out on that image, it would be the Caltex refinery in the background.
Indeed.
And then just to finish off, this is one of my most memorable photographic moments. It's not the greatest photograph I've ever taken, but sometimes in getting to get that moment where you've taken a photograph, it makes it one of the special ones. This is an Andean pass in the Western Andes. Was on a trip earlier in May last year, and thank goodness COVID-19 didn't happen last year, because I wouldn't have got to do this trip. Although that is a first world problem. And so we had spent a few days in the very high altitudes in a place called Abramalaga, which is essentially on the spine of the Andes between the lowlands in the west and the Amazon on the east. And at 4,200 meters, it's an incredible effort to get to see any birds at all. And Royal Cyclodes is probably one of the most endangered birds on the planet. There's less than 200 of them remaining, and they live in the most inaccessible places up at 4,200 meters. They live in these polylepis forests. On that right-hand image, more or less in the center of the image, there's some vegetation that you can see, and that's where they occur. That's essentially what the forest looks like. It's not quite forest, it's called elfin forest. And we hiked down into this particular forest and spent some time there, and eventually got views of the bird feeding in these mosses and ferns. And it's an image that probably is not, once again, one of the technically best images I've taken, but it certainly is in the top 5 photographs I've taken in my lifetime, and certainly will remain that way for a very long time, I think. So I think that essentially brings us to a conclusion. I know we've gone on for an hour and a half, and we intended an hour. Just to finish off, firstly to say thank you very much to BirdLife for all the support they give us. They've definitely got our name out there, and we've received so much more interest since they did so. So thank you, BirdLife. We hope to continue the partnership. And then Mike, just to say thanks very much for your assistance. We're definitely going to have you back next week.
Thanks. I've been well behaved, have I?
Very, very well behaved. We appreciate it. And Dave, thanks for taking the controls this evening and for managing some of the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mike and Michael. You guys did a top effort turning this around in a week. We usually do these sort of once a month or once every 6 weeks. So yeah, thank you. It's been this has been fantastic.
And then a final word from me before I bring it all to a close. We will be doing another one next week. We will continue with the photography theme. We've got a few different topics to talk about. So thanks very much for joining us, and we'll try to keep it a bit shorter next week. And keep safe and keep well while in lockdown. Good night.
Thanks, Mike. Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.